Hello, and let's talk about haptic sounds and microanimations in React Native. So I have built this little app where you could purchase matcha lattes. So you can add it to your favorites or remove it from your favorites. You can choose between 1 and 3 matcha lattes to purchase, and you can add them to your cart. Now in this demo, we're going to go through this little UI that I've already built, and we're going to use haptic sounds and animations to basically enhance it and make it a little bit nicer to use. Now, some of these things, haptic feedback in particular, are kind of difficult to convey in a video. So all of this code is available on Expo Snack. So if you go on snack.expo.dev, add Kadikraman and haptics and microanimations, and then in the preview panel, choose My Device, you can scan the barcode and basically view this demo on your own phone. Alright, let's start with haptic feedback. Haptic feedback is basically any kind of tactile feedback, meaning that you can feel it, that's produced by an electronic device. In the world of mobile development, haptic feedback is primarily just vibration. Now, my example is built using Expo, and this is because I wanted to make this available on Expo Snack. But you can do this on both Expo and plain React Native, so I've linked to libraries in both. In Expo, there is a library called Expo Haptics, so install it using expo install Expo Haptics. And in plain React Native, there is a library called React Native Haptic Feedback, which you can install with yarn or npm. I've actually used both of these libraries, so they both work equally as well. Now, in the interest of speed, I've already installed these libraries to my demo project, and I've commented out the code that we're going to add, so I'm just going to talk through how it works. First thing we do is obviously import the haptics from Expo Haptics. Now let's have a look at where we would like to add it. Well, just starting at the top of the page, we could do haptic feedback, so a little vibration, if you have added something to your favorites. So if we scroll down to where we add things to our favorites, so we've got a icon here for the favorites. When we press on it, we handle toggle favorites. And here it is. Okay, so we've got use callback that says to favorite, and if it's not already your favorite, let's do this. So we call haptics, impact async, and here you can choose the strength or the vibration. So you can have a light, medium, or a heavy vibration. Now, another place we could use it is obviously the add to cart button, especially because this is an asynchronous request. So when you add to cart, we have a little bit of a delay until the cart is ready. So let's find where that button is. All right, so we have our CTA button here. It's got on press. It calls handle add to cart. And this is a use callback. Obviously, I'm emulating the loading here, but in your real application, this might be do an API request. So we could do haptics impact async, and let's do impact feedback style heavy, just to make it really obvious that something's changed. And the last thing we can really interact with here is the quantity picker. Now, this is actually quite cool because there are 3 types of haptic feedback, light, medium, and heavy. You could actually use the haptic feedback to indicate how many lattes you've chosen. So let's find the quantity picker. All right, so on press, we do handle select quantity. Okay, so here what we can actually do is based on the new quantity, if the quantity is 1, we'll do a haptics impact async and do the light feedback. If the quantity is 2, we could do a medium feedback. And otherwise, or in our case, if the quantity is 3, we could do a heavy feedback. So now if you press on these, this will give you the lightest feedback and this will give you the heaviest feedback. And that's just one example of how you could use the haptic feedback to communicate differences in scale. Haptic feedback is always also super handy if you have a slider component, just to indicate that a new option has been reached. Now, obviously, visually on the screen, you won't be able to tell the difference, but if you try this out on your phone on Expo Snack, you'll be able to see what it feels like. I've also added a little button to enable or disable enhancements, which will basically disable all the animations and haptic feedback and sound that we're going to add, and you'll be able to experience what it's like to use this little app with and without the enhancements. Now, next up, sounds. Now, sounds in mobile applications is quite interesting because when it comes to, for example, mobile games or video games, we expect everything to make sound. But a lot of the apps that we use day to day don't really make sound. And we can't really rely on sound too much because a lot of people don't have sound enabled. I mean, I, for one, always have my phone on silent mode. However, this can be a fun little enhancement that you could you could add for people who do have sound on. So again, there is an Expo and a plain React Native library for it that I've linked to. So in plain React Native, we got React Native Sound, which you can use. And in Expo, we have got Expo AV. So this is a catch-all library for both sound and video, which you can install using Expo install Expo AV. So again, I've added just a little code example just to give you an idea of how it works. Effectively, you choose a sound file, which can be within your application, or it can be downloaded from a remote URL. Then you create a sound object and you play it. Now let's go to our example. Where could we add a sound? Well, I was thinking it would be fun to have a little happy sound if you've added something to your favorites. So let's start by importing audio from Expo AV. And let's go down to where we have our handle toggle favorites callback. And underneath it, we have this play sound callback. So commenting this out, let's see what this does. It creates a sound using the Expo audio library. And we also need to pass it in the source of the sound. So I have a notification sound that I already packaged into this code base. Then we set the sound. So we have this React use state here to set the current sound. And finally, we call play async. So let's just uncomment this out. So now, if it's not currently your favorite, we do the haptic feedback and we also play a sound. So let's add this to our dependencies array as well. And now if you are using Expo AV, you'll also need to unload the sound once the component dismounts to prevent any memory leaks. So I've got a React use effect here that says, if we have a current sound in our use state, then unload it, otherwise do nothing. So this gets run when the component dismounts. And now when I add this to my favorites, you hear a little sound. And finally, we have microanimations. Now, microanimations are any UI animation that isn't strictly necessary. For example, sliding a menu open, or fading in an image, or scale a button on press. When done right, a lot of users don't even notice that microanimations are there, but they do add to the joy of using your application. There are loads of animation libraries available. In this demo, I'm going to use Reanimated 2, which is definitely my favorite. Reanimated 1 was originally built to mitigate some deficiencies in React Native's built-in animation library. But Reanimated 2 kind of went further, and effectively they made a hooks-based animation library for React Native, which is the easiest and most straightforward, in my opinion, to use if you're using functional components. This is available on both Expo and in plain React Native, and the installation instructions are available here. Now, let's use Reanimated to animate some things on the screen. Well, firstly, let's animate this heart when you add something to your favorites. So what I want to do is, if I'm tapping on this heart, it's already playing the sound, it's already giving me haptic feedback, but if I'm adding to my favorites, I'd also like this heart to kind of expand a little, so like a little pulse. So first thing that we want to do is let's import Reanimated from React Native Reanimated, and let's import use shared value and use animated style. A shared value is basically the value that you are going to be using as a central point for your animation. And use animated style is basically a hook that returns a style object that will contain the animated style. So you can use the shared values within this animated style object. So for the heart, I've created a heart scale shared value. Now let's go to the toggle favorites. So what we want to do is we want to expand the heart and make it go back to normal. So let me just show you what happens if I don't use this. So let's do a heart scale dot value, and let's do 1.3. So if I add something to my favorites, it will increase the heart style to 1.3. Now let's go to the use animated style. So this is the style I'm going to apply to the heart. So I'm going to apply a transform with a scale. And this is pretty simple. It's just using the value of the shared value. And lastly, what we want to do is we want to use this heart style on our heart. And in order to do that, Let's find where the heart is. Okay, here it is. So it's wrapped in a pressable. So I want to apply the animated style to the pressable. In order to apply the animated style to anything, it needs to be an animated component. So what we can do is we can use Reanimator. So this is the default export, create animated component, and then pass in any component that we want. So in our case, we'll pass in pressable. And this is a reanimated pressable component. Now if we scroll down and replace this with reanimated pressable and save. And now if I add it to my favorites, you'll see that the heart kind of went really big, but obviously it doesn't go back. And also it jumped to really big, it didn't really animate. So in React Native Reanimated, we have a bunch of these with exports, which basically you can use to set the value to a new value, but gradually. So one of the most popular ones is with timing. So this basically creates a smooth transition. So if I go to this hard scale.value, and rather than assigning it to 1.2, I do with timing and 1.3. And now when I click on this, you'll see that the heart kind of increases gradually rather than really quickly. Now, what we actually want is we want it to expand, but also then go back to normal. And then for that, we can use a with sequence export. And as the name suggests, it basically allows you to do multiple transitions one after the other. So now when I comment this out, we'll see that we do a sequence and we animate from our initial value to 1.3. And we can pass in an object to specify how quickly we want to do it. And then after that's done, we animate back to 1. And now when I add something to our favorites, you'll see that it does a little pulse. Next up, let's animate the add to cart button. So at the moment, when we add something to our cart, we get a little loading spinner, and that's pretty much it. So what we'd like to do is we want to make it more obvious that this button is disabled. So what I would like to do is make this button slightly smaller while it's loading, but also make the opacity lighter, so make it a little bit lighter so it makes it really obvious that it's disabled. So let's go to where the button is. So we have our CTA here. Notice that this is also a pressable component. So as before with the heart, we have to convert this into a reanimated component. So let's do reanimated pressable instead. And so I've got a shared value here already, which is called button scale. So we're going to start this with 1, as with the heart scale. And for the button style, so we've got a use animated style here. And let's start with just the transform. So this does exactly the same as the heart. So it uses the transform and scales based on the button scale. So let's apply this style to our button to convert this into an array. And add the button style. And now we also need to actually set the value as the add to cart action is ongoing. So if we go to this callback, and we'll do, so button scale.value with timing. So we'll go from 1 to 0.9, and this animation should take 200 milliseconds. And then after we waited for a second and we've done the haptic feedback, and we've implemented the cart count, we will put the button scale value back to 1, so we'll go back to 100% the original size. Let's update the dependency array. One thing I've noticed when working with Reanimator 2 is that hot reloading doesn't always work as expected. So whenever editing the styles, it's a good practice to just reload the app completely, just to make sure that you have the latest version. All right, now when I press the add to cart button, you can see that it scales down, and once the add to cart action is finished, it will scale back up. Now, one cool thing about these values is that you can use the same value for multiple things. I would like this button to also be dimmed when it's smaller. So to do that, we can update the opacity. Now, here's a keyword that we haven't used before, interpolate. So this is another export from React Native Reanimated. And basically what this does is we pass in the value that we are using to do the animation, and then we pass in two arrays. So this is basically a mapping from this array to this. So the first array is basically the expected scale. So we know that we only set the button scale between 0.9 and 1. And what we're saying is that if it's 0.9, make this opacity 0.5, so 50% opacity. If this value is 1, make the opacity 1, but also handle all of these values in between. So it will automatically know, for example, if you have, 0.95, it will do 0.75, so 75% opacity, and it will automatically handle all the values in between. So let's save that and refresh the app. And now when I add to cart, you'll see that I'll have both animations at the same time. And the last animation what we had was the amount picker. So at the moment, there's no animation here, but I thought it would be nice if this would fade in rather than just snapping in. Now, a way to do that is, again, using a shared value. So I've got a quantity item here. So this component is for each of these buttons. So it knows whether it's selected, what to do when you press it. The children is just a number. The children is just a label. Now we're going to start with creating a shared value. So we'll do, if the item is selected, we'll start with 1, otherwise we'll start with 0. So these will be the two values that we're going to be toggling in between. Now, at the moment, we do, okay, if it's selected, display this, otherwise display this. One easy way to do fade animations is basically to render both of the items on top of each other and then animate the opacity the opposite way. So what I'm going to do is remove this inline if, and also I'm going to convert these views into reanimated views. Now, some of the core components like view and text are actually built into reanimated. So instead of creating a reanimated component, you can do reanimated.view. And this will make it into a reanimated view. Now this means that we can pass in animated styles. Now we will need to have two styles, so we need to have a selected style and a not selected style. And both of them will handle opacity of the item. So the selected style, the opacity will just be the current value. So if it's selected, the opacity is 1. If it's not selected, the opacity is 0. For the not selected style, we want to do the opposite. So we can use the interpolate function. So we pass in our value and we basically create this mapping function. So we go from 0 to 1, but we want to map that to 1 to 0. So this creates the opposite effect and also animates all the values in between. Now let's pass these styles into the views. So the selected and not selected. Now all that's left to do is actually update this value when the selected state changes. So to do that, we can use a use effect. And because we have is selected in the dependencies array, we'll know that this effect gets run whenever is selected changes. Now, if is selected changes, we will go to this use effect and we will assign the new value for this my value. That's why you should name them something other than value. And we will use the timing function, and basically we're doing if is selected is true, let's change it to 1, otherwise let's change it to 0, and let's take 400 milliseconds to do that, which will create the animation. Now this effectively will update these two styles so that the selected version of this view will get opacity 1 and the not selected one will get opacity 0. Now let's refresh and you'll see that when I change this, you'll see a little fade animation. That's it for me. I hope you enjoyed it, and here is the QR code if you want to try it out on your phone. Thanks very much.